There we
Yeah.
go.
Okay.
Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Donna Vitek, that is I, and Dr. Holowchak, that's the other guy in the box, with Jeffy in the background.
Oh,
The real Jefferson, the cute Jefferson. Oh, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
glad to be here on this hot, overcast. What is today? Thursday? Yeah,
I don't know.
Thursday. That's how it feels. That's how it goes. We got a lot to do. Very, very great letter. You had a very good pick here. It's just a tough letter to do, so we need
Oh,
to get into this as soon as we can.
yeah, it's part of my civics, Florida Civic Seal of Excellence course that I'm doing. And when it was mentioned, I said, oh boy, I looked at the letter and I said, we've got to do this letter so I can learn more about it, because they didn't really go into the letter, it was referenced. So before we get started, I want to quickly tell our viewers your credentials. Dr. Holowchak is a PhD professor of philosophy and history who has taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He's written, oh boy, what, 26? How many books are you up to?
2026.
26 books, published books on Thomas Jefferson, and over 200 essays. And the locations of his essays and the names of his books will be in the video description in the YouTube video. With our show One Work, Five Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson. So today we bring you a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Thomas Law on moral sensing. Ooh, I can't wait to discuss this. Dr. Holowchak says it is one of the most singular letters in Thomas Jefferson's corpus because it readily leads itself to being misread. Ooh. So he will point that out for us today. It has been taken as evidence that Thomas Jefferson believed that atheists could be moral, that those bereft of a moral sense could morally compensate, and that Thomas Jefferson was a moral relativist. All such positions, says Dr. Holowchak, are mistaken, and today he pledges to show us what that is, that is the case. So I am Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions. Let us begin, and I'll start sharing the visuals that we have. Okay. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, we are ready. Question number 1. Are you ready, Dr. Holowchak?
I am.
Okay, first, I wanted to know, who is Thomas Law?
He was a British businessman who worked with the East India Company and collected revenue, and later on moved to Washington, D.C. And I'm not going to say much about him because I don't know much about him, but he does take it upon himself to write Thomas Jefferson. And so they had a brief correspondence, not too many letters shared between the two. And in 1814, prior to that, he writes Jefferson's letter, and Jefferson writes him back on, and it gives us his fullest elaboration on just what the moral sense is. Not so much how it works, but what it is.
Okay. Okay, question number 2. The letter seems chiefly about theories of morality, finding the foundations of it. Thomas Jefferson considers truth, love of God, love of beauty, and self-love as candidates, and summarily rejects each. Why and what, then, is the foundation of morality?
You see by the slide there, we have the 4 candidates, and Jefferson's going to go in his fairly lengthy letter to Law and go through each of these and see whether any of them could be, each of them has been said by others to be a candidate for the foundation of morality, right? And Jefferson's going to go through each somewhat summarily and reject each. So I ask you to take us to the next slide when he looks at truth.
Truth.
Okay, I'm going to read through this for those of you who are looking on your cell phones. You can't see, but he says, of all the theories on this question, most whimsical seems to have been that of Wollaston, who considers truth as the foundation of morality. And Jefferson goes, the thief who steals your guinea does wrong only inasmuch as he acts a lie. in using your guinea as if it were his own. Truth is certainly a branch of morality and a very important one to society, but presented as its foundation is as if a tree had been taken up by the roots and had its stem reversed in the air and one of the branches planted in the ground. So, you know, it's important to realize here what he says. Truth is not the foundation of morality, but it's one of the branches. So we can leave that, go on to the next.
Okay. Go to the next slide.
Yep. Truth
Okay.
is not a foundation, it's a branch.
A branch. Okay.
He looks at others. Says, some have made love of God. In other words, if I love God, I'm perfectly moral. It's a foundation of morality. This too is but a branch of our moral duties, which are generally divided into duties to God and duties to man. Look at this, which are generally divided into duties to God and duties to man. If we did a good act merely from love of God and a belief that it is pleasing to him, whence arises the morality of the atheists? It is idle to say, as some do, that no such being exists. So again, he's looking at the love of God, and we'll come back to the slide when we ask another question, as the foundation. It's not the foundation, it's a branch. So we have one, we have truth as a branch, love of God as a branch.
Okay.
Love of God is not the foundation, because if we love God, then that would be perfectly sufficient for us being moral. He doesn't think so. If we spoke the truth, as the Stoics say, that would be perfect for us to be perfectly moral. You know, that's a very attractive view to me, the Stoic view, but Jefferson thinks that's not true.
Right, because he did mention some atheists that he said to have been among the moral virtuous of men, and he mentioned.
And we'll come back to that. I mean, you showed me another question later, and yeah, we'll come back to the moral atheists.
Okay, should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, next slide.
Okay.
Taste. He says the to kalan, the Greek for the beautiful of others, is founded in a different faculty, that of taste, which is not even a branch of morality. So right off the bat, forget taste. It doesn't work. We have indeed an innate sense of what we call beautiful, but it is exercised chiefly on subjects addressed to the fancy, whether through the eye, in visible forms, as in landscape, animal figure, dress. So taste, he says, it's a separate faculty. We talked about the aesthetic sense. That's what he's getting here, taste. We have a third faculty. We have our intellect, we have moral sense, and we have the aesthetic sense. The aesthetic sense is taste. It is what enables us to identify what is beautiful, what is sublime, and what is not beautiful, and what is not sublime.
Okay.
Right? And as we said before, taste works neatly in conjunction with the moral sense faculty, right? Because we tend to identify actions that are right, the right thing to do, as something that is also beautiful. So the two seem to work hand in glove in some sense, right? Recognizing that goodness is itself beautiful, but it is not even a fact. It is a separate faculty, and the beautiful has nothing to do with what is right, says Jefferson. And we go to the last slide. Self-love. He's talking about, he says, self-interest, or rather self-love, or egoism, has been more plausibly substituted on the basis of morality. This is in philosophy today called philosophical egoism.
Okay.
But Jefferson has a sort of strange argument here. I consider our relations with others as constituting the boundaries of morality. With ourselves, we stand on the ground of identity, not of relation, which last, requiring two subjects, excludes self-love, confined to a single one. To ourselves, in strict language, we can owe no duties, obligation requiring also two parties. So he's by definition ruling out self-love. It's not a very good argument. He's just saying, by definition, morality constitutes is a relational property of a person and another person, something else, right? Self-love is a relation to me and myself. It's really a monistic sort of quality, right? It's not a relation, it's identity, he says. If I consider myself love, in other words, just acting for the sake of my own benefit, it's not a dualistic quality, and morality requires dualism, requires my relations to other people, not just myself. Right. The argument is terrible, but at least this gets us to understand. He doesn't really get at the gist of what's wrong with self-love as an argument. Doesn't get at the gist of those who argue that narcissism or self-love ought to be the basis. But he says self-love is no part of morality, and that's what gets us through that. So you said, what is the foundation? And you have my beautiful tree that it took me 18 hours to do.
Should I go to the tree?
Yeah, go to the
Okay.
tree.
Oh, wow, what a tree.
I don't see it. I don't.
You don't see the tree?
No, there it is. No.
Yeah.
What is the foundation of morality in the moral sense? Right? We have a sensory faculty about which we've talked the last couple of weeks, last few weeks, not last week, weeks prior to that. Remember, he says truth. So we look at truth. It's one of the branches. God is one of the branches. Others, meaning love of others. Right? If we want to say love of truth, love of God, love of others. So to be a perfectly moral person, one needs to be truthful.
Mm-hmm.
One needs to be, I don't want to say God-fearing. He doesn't believe in God fear. He believes in God love.
Okay.
And then he believes in other love. One needs to be not only benevolent, having good wishes, but beneficent, having good deeds. So the moral
boys,
sense,
we have to like other people to be moral. Oh, I'm in trouble. No,
well, you have.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
Yeah, I know you're teasing, but that is a very hard thing to do at times.
Yeah.
That doesn't rule out, by the way, treating people justly. That doesn't rule out punishment for people that are miscreants.
Okay.
But at least one has to have a sense of duty to others.
Okay.
Even the miscreant, the person who behaves unjustly, is in need of help, right?
Okay.
Throwing a person in prison and forgetting about the problem is not a solution to the problem. And so much for that. That's his tree. Like I said, I had to find a suitable tree, then cut and paste these things on there. It took me
I like it.
Didn't quite take me 18 hours, but it took me a little bit longer than it should take a rational person to do something so simple. Okay. So that's answer to number 2.
Okay, are you ready for number 3?
I am.
Okay. Thomas Jefferson rejects love of God as the foundation because of the morality of the atheist. And he adds, such beings do exist. Are there, for Thomas Jefferson, moral atheists?
Well, if we go back to that slide where we talk about love of God, we'll analyze that. We're doing something differently here.
Okay.
As you mentioned, is because this is such a difficult letter and has been taken in so many different ways by scholars. I want to be clear on this. My friend Arthur Shearer, who's no small scholar, is a very fine scholar. He takes Jefferson literally here. Jefferson says in the red, if we did a good act merely from the love of God and a belief that it's pleasing to him, whence arises the morality of the atheist? It's idle to say that, as some do, that no such being exists. And he gives examples of Frenchmen who are highly moral people, but are atheists.
Right.
They're of the most virtue of men. Their virtue then must have some other foundation than love of God. Now, notice he says their virtue must have some other foundation. That love of God can't be the foundation.
Right.
Right? Because they behave with respect to other people. If we go back to the tree, now you don't have to go back to it literally, they're truthful people. And they behave beneficently with other human beings. They just don't believe that God exists. So in other words, if we go back to the tree of morality of my reading, and I want to show that my reading is correct, they get 2 out of 3 right.
Okay.
Right. Now, why is love of God important? He says prior to that, says our moral duties. It's a branch of our moral duties, which are generally divided into duties to God and duties to man. I take that literally. When he says generally divided, you might say, well, generally is kind of weak, but he means it's generally accepted that there are 2 branches, love of God and duties to God and duties to man. What do we do with that? What I think is going on is that Jefferson is acknowledging that there are some people Who get 2 out of 3? Who say, yeah, I'm very truthful to others, and I interact well with other people. I care about them. I care about my fellow human beings. I just don't believe in God. But recall in the letter to Adams, the letter to which we referred many times ago, Jefferson talked about knowing God in the universe. He says, when you look up in the cosmos and you see design and order, and you don't infer from that by argument, you just see God. So it is, you see God, you feel God, you don't argue for God. So knowing God is not an intellectual process, it's a feeling. It's a seeing or a feeling. And how does the moral sense work? It works through feeling and sense. And Jefferson says in that letter to Adams, I feel, therefore I exist. He doesn't say like Descartes says, I think, therefore I exist. He goes, I feel. Existence is implied by feeling, by having moral sense, right? In a weird way, right? And he's following Destat de Tracy, who says that, who argues that. So the idea here is the moral atheist is a person who is behaving for all intents and purposes like a moral person, right? But he's not perfectly moral because he doesn't believe in God. He's missing something. It's the same way of seeing two people doing the right thing and one person doing it because his intentions, as Aristotle says in book 2.4 of his Nicomachean Ethics, right? Intentions are important. One must not only do the right thing, but you have to do it for the right reasons.
Right.
Right. If I'm giving a pint of blood, right, in time of need because I'm trying to score, I'll be crude here, trying to score with the babe who's the nurse and she's really hot, and that's the wrong reason.
Right.
So it's not a
You hear
moral
that,
action.
fellas? Listen to what he's saying. You got to do things
Yes.
for the right reasons.
It's a matter of having the right reason. I need to give pint of blood for the right reason. My intentions need to be right. So in other words, the person who goes there with the right intention that gives blood is behaving identically to the person who goes there to try to get the phone number of the nurse.
Right.
Right. And just by looking at the behavior, you'd say, oh, so Jefferson is saying, okay, in my estimation, that the moral atheist is not completely moral. He's not moral because he's not completely moral. You can't be 2/3 a moralist.
I understand now. Okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
And hopefully that makes a lot of sense.
It does. It really does make a lot of sense.
So I think Arthur's wrong. You can't. So this is a thing where you think, where's the morality of the atheist? You can't take that literally. What Jefferson is saying, the morality of the atheist is not perfectly moral. He's partially
right. Moral. Okay. Question number 4. Thomas Jefferson then talks of deficiencies in moral sensing and ways of compensation for them. What is his argument? And I will go to slide 9 for the moral relativism.
Yeah, this is a long passage, and I apologize for being so long, but
is this the
no, keep going.
Oh,
right here.
Moral relativism. Okay.
This is not a relativism. This is a compensation for not having a moral sense. A lot of people have taken this passage to mean that Jefferson is clearly saying there are some people that are, and he cites Napoleon later, some people don't have a moral sense, just like some people are born blind. But he says there are ways of supplying, of compensating for the defect. He says 1, by education; 2, these are my numbers, by appeals to reason and calculation; 3, by presenting to the being so unhappily conformed other motives to good to eschew evil. So what people have typically do, and I don't get this in the least, is they say, well, I might not be born with moral sense, but I can be a moral person through education, through reason, and through motivation to conform. And Jefferson, think about that argument. It sounds reasonable. I may not be born with a moral sense, but I can be a moral person if I have the right sort of education, if I appeal to reason. Remember, Jefferson says the moral sense faculty is not rational. So again, what he's arguing is that a person can have the appearance of being a moral person through education. I can convince you, look at what he says in red. as the love or hatred, rejection by those among whom he lives and those whose society is necessary, right? I can convince you to behave morally by saying, if you don't, I won't love you. And you think, well, what does that behave?
Uh-oh, I think,
By
oh, Dr. Holowchak, I think we're losing you.
demonstrations, by
Oh.
your what?
Oh, can you repeat?
Oh, my internet.
Yeah, it went out a little bit. So,
Okay. Well, okay. A says I can. What I'm trying to say is yeah, my connection is a bit unstable, bad weather, but I can convince you to behave morally by withholding love from you or telling you I'm going to love you if you do that. I can convince you to behave morally by showing you that it promotes your interest to love other people in the long run. So in other words, you'll get benefits. I can convince you through rewards and penalties established by laws. I can convince you showing that a future state of retribution for the evil, as well as the good. In other words, if you behave morally, you'll go to heaven. But again, these are appeals to reason, and Jefferson is very clear that moral sense has nothing to do with reason. So what's going on here is that we're bringing reason into play for someone who doesn't have a moral sense. It's not that you're going to be moral, but you're going to be behaving morally. They're two different things.
right. It's an act, kind of like an act. Somebody who's
It's
just
sort of
doing
like an
it.
act, but at some point we do have to conform you. If you don't have a moral sense like Napoleon,
Right.
we do have to do things to conform you to behave that. It's just like people who are blind. Well, I can't give you your eyesight back, but I can help you get by in the world of the blind by showing you certain techniques, certain things you can do, so
Right.
that you're going to behave very much like a person who has eyes, or very much like a person who can't hear or can't smell, for example. So these are, he says, these are correctives. But again, I emphasize people get this wrong. They think, okay, what Jefferson is saying, that if you don't have a moral sense, we can bring to bear reason and all these other incentives so that you will become moral. No, you're not going to become moral. You'll never become moral. You'll be able to behave morally,
Right.
without being moral. There's a difference between someone being something and behaving one way. Again, Aristotle says in book 2.4 is Nicomachean Ethics, right? We have to be a moral person, one has to do the right thing, book 2.4. One has to have the right frame of mind, the right intention. And here, there's no right intention. I don't feel. I might do the right thing, but I have no feeling for it. Jefferson thinks it's important. And then I have to do it all the time, right? To do the right thing one time and then never to do it again is not behaving morally, not making a moral person.
Yeah.
So if I lack, for example, let's take someone who lacks a sense of beauty. I can look at the natural bridge, Jefferson's natural bridge, and not see it whenever, because isn't that magnificent? Isn't it sublime, beautiful? And I say, I don't really get it. And someone says, well, you might not get it, but here, look, if you look at it this way, you understand it's constructed. It's really kind of cool. And I say, yeah, I guess I understand what you mean. It's kind of cool, but I don't feel anything. You're just never going to be moral if you're born without, you're never going to see if you're born without eyes. You're born without a moral sense, you're never going to be a moral person. You can act morally, you won't be moral. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I can't stop thinking about the state of our union today. And I have a question. I don't expect an answer because this could be a show in itself, but I'm wondering if the further we move away from the love of God or any biblical principles, if that is what's contributing to our problems in society. I don't want an answer because that's, like I said, a show. That'll be its own show. So
well, let's just say, Jefferson has a different view of morality than I do.
Right.
But nonetheless, Jefferson's would certainly say, I can answer that succinctly. You can't have everything I've said and everything I've written. His political republicanism is reducible to his morality.
Right.
He thinks it's going to work because he thinks all people have a moral sense. If people don't have a moral sense, and it's the question whether or not we do have moral sense, then it's not to say that it can't work, but it's certainly not a good thing. He would answer your question certainly affirmatively. You can't have good government, and it only makes sense. Look, John Adams thinks people are rotten to the core, so not rotten to the core, but they're not particularly nice. So what we have to do is have structures and checks and balances discourse on Davila. And he may be right. I don't know, but all I'm trying to say is, Jefferson thinks you can't force good. You can get people sort of to behave the right way, but you can't force them to be moral people. It just has to come spontaneously through the moral sense.
Right.
And we need a form of government that encourages moral activity.
Right.
So he would answer your question in the affirmative, clearly.
I wonder. Okay. So, well, that's good.
And I just think I think he's right in some sense. It's obvious, if you want moral political government, moral politicians, you have to have moral people.
Right.
If the people electing them have no regard for morality, why would they bitch when their representatives are not moral?
Right. Right. Exactly.
That's all.
Right.
It's bottom up. It's people driven for Jefferson.
Very good.
My beard manager here. Now I have less beard.
Your beard manager. Oh, don't you have a popper now too somewhere?
I did. You missed it.
I missed it. I know. I totally spaced out. Question number 5, the last question. Thomas Jefferson ends with a very curious argument. What? Oh. Should I continue?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sure.
He ends with a very curious argument for utility being standard of virtuous activity, because he says an action in one country may be virtuous while vicious in another. Does that not make virtuous and morality relative and non-objective?
That's a really good. Go to the last slide. It's a really good question. And this letter, as well as another letter, when he says the standard of virtuous activity is utility, which means whether things turn out good or bad. Right? Not that something is right or wrong in and of itself. Now look at what he says here. Nature has constituted utility to man as the standard and test of virtue. Men living in different countries under different circumstances, different habits, may have different utilities. The same act therefore being useful and consequently virtuous in one country, which is injurious and vicious in another country. Differently circumstanced. I love that. Differently circumstanced. I love the way he writes. Adrian Coke and Gene Yarborough have argued, well, clearly we look at this in another letter. Jefferson grew up being sort of like a stoic intuitionist, that we just know certain things are right and wrong. And that later in life, what happens, we come to realize that we see other cultures and having different standards. Right? We can't make absolutist claims about something is morally right and wrong, because something could be right. So this takes us to not just relativism. Relativism just means that the standards are different in different situations. It's relative, right? It's subjective. There is no right or wrong. Now that can't be right for many reasons, and I've argued this trenchantly in many of my, I don't know what that word means either. That's your word for the day.
My word for the day, trenchant.
Trenchant. I have to throw in a word of the day. You know me. I'm just.
I'm writing it down. I'm writing it down. Trenchant.
I'm obdurate.
Oh no, not 2 words. One a day. That's it.
Yes. Okay, one a day. It's like a vitamin, right?
Yeah.
Where are we going here? They can't be right because Jefferson's a progressivist, and he talks in several letters about moral progress. Talks about how people back in the day, in the earlier days when they went to war, they would slaughter the captives, and now we don't. And Jefferson himself, as governor, says, I treat them humanely because they're captives of war. They're not to be used as tools.
Right.
He clearly thinks that morality is improving. Take the issue of slavery. Do you think Jefferson ever thinks that slavery could be relative, that because some places have slavery, right, in different circumstances, that slavery is good in that case and slavery is bad? Do you think in some cultures that cannibalism is accepted and it's not considered to be bad? Jefferson thinks cannibalism is morally acceptable.
Mm.
What he's hinting at is that different cultures have different standards of what is useful, because some of them, just like different cultures are not very sophisticated in the sciences, they lag behind morality. They're underdeveloped. They have slaves because they think slavery is acceptable. They practice cannibalism because they think cannibalism is acceptable. Cannibalism, by the way, is not as disgusting as many people think. In some sense, it's disgusting, but cannibals eat like Native Americans. Some of them practice cannibalism. The reason is that they considered it to be taking in the spirit of the person whom they're eating. But anyways, what I think is going on is Jefferson just is asking us to have a sense of moral sensitivity to people that are lagging behind morally, right? You don't force the South to get rid of all their slaves, even though slavery is wrong, because it's going to cripple the Southern economy and cripple them, and they're not ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, I said 100 times, the right thing to do done at the wrong time is the wrong thing to do.
Right.
So that's circumstantialist and relative, but it's objective. In other words, for me to go into Native American culture and right off the bat try to tell a certain tribe that cannibalism is bad and convince them of their wickedness, they're probably going to kill me and eat me. So,
lunch.
Secondly, I write, and I'll throw this out last. I'll try to give you 5 minutes to end this.
Okay.
But Jefferson read Cicero, and in his work on duties, he writes of Panatius, who, in agreement with another Stoic, these are middle Stoics, not the early Stoics, and he says, Panatius says, to commit wrong deeds is never expedient, utile, useful, because it is always wicked, and always expedient to be good, because it's always good for a man to be virtuous. Honestum is virtuous, utile is useful. What Panatius is arguing, and Jefferson was very familiar with this work, is that the useful thing is always the virtuous thing. When we understand what is really useful.
Mm-hmm.
The cannibal is understanding a bastardized sense of usefulness. The civilized person understands that cannibalism is wrong. Slavery is always going to be wrong. Cannibalism is always going to be wrong, but there needs to be a sense of sensitivity to people that are lagging in moral understanding. And he thinks people are growing in that regard in terms of knowing what the right thing is. We always have a sense that harming another person is bad, but we rationalize it by saying, oh, I take in the spirit of the word, whatever. So I think he wants to argue that we always know the right thing to do in some sense, but we are culturally retarded in many cases in our moral sense. So does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak. And coming up, I am going to take a little bit of a hiatus because I've got a lot on my plate with testing and course that I'm taking, and deadlines are coming up. And so we will resume our shows on August 28th, I think, or 31st. No, August 31st, I think. Thursday, August 31st. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's the date I had sent. Okay, so the next show will be a very intriguing letter, one to younger brother Randolph, dated May 25th, 1813. And I'll bet that many of our followers did not know that Thomas Jefferson had a brother. So can you give us a teaser, Dr. Holowchak? Oh, this is his brother. This could actually be the father of Sally Hemings.
Yes, and more than likely, I think he was the father of Eston Hemings.
Right. That's where the Jefferson DNA came from. Okay, so can you give us
I changed the letter to January 11th, 1789.
January 11th. Okay.
The idea is we're just going to be introduced to Thomas Jefferson's brother. He's a younger brother, not very bright. His brother had a twin sister, and I'll talk a little bit about the correspondence. There wasn't much to it. His brother wasn't very bright. He also had another sister that was mentally challenged in some sense, and she presumably drowned in the James River or another river, if
Oh,
not the river by Jefferson's house.
Hmm.
And it's very strange to understand how Jefferson could be so inordinately intelligent and yet his brother not be. There are many people have tried to show that Jefferson's brother wasn't as dull as the letters seem to suggest. I think, no, he was as dull as those letters suggest.
yeah.
And I'll talk about the relationship between the two, focusing on the one letter, and go back and go into other letters as well. And we'll say
Okay.
something about his brother Randolph.
Okay.
It's something that scholars very rarely, you can read biographies of Jefferson at that time and not even know that he had a brother.
Right.
Brother.
Yeah, and that's important. It's important to everything going on today too, to know that there was another male Jefferson that existed. So that this is, I think, an important piece. Okay, so if you'd like to contact Dr. Holowchak for to make an appearance at an event at your college or a political event, you can contact him at mholowchak@hotmail.com, or his Twitter handle is at Dr. Holowchak. That's HOLOWCHAK. Or you can contact me at Donna Vitek 1776. My favorite year. Or you can reach Dr. Holowchak at his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. So Facebook hasn't shut you down yet?
No, I don't post anything,
Oh, okay.
controversial. It's just, I'm sort of bored with it. I
Yeah.
don't get any mileage on my Thomas Jefferson page. Most people don't look at it because they restricted viewership. People that like the page or want warnings of what's going on, they don't get them and stuff. So
You should try Twitter, Dr. Holowchak.
well, I'll
Become more
try
active
it.
on Twitter.
When you're done with your thing, you can walk me through that. I already had problems. So I put WhatsApp on my phone and that went bad, and had it on my computer, that went bad. So I'm challenged when it comes to these technological advances that we have here. I'm sorry to say. I have it up here for Thomas Jefferson when it comes to displaying it in a way that's palatable for our viewers and listeners. I'm challenged. I openly admit that. So, okay, we're all set then, huh? We got it all in. I'm
Yes, before we're cut off.